Conceit is a problem in Buddhism, and in fact there are 3 different kinds of conceit that we should really become aware of in our practice and in our lives. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can find courses about the early Buddhist Dharma. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. Now, conceit. Conceit is a very deep problem in early Buddhism. Perhaps the most deep problem that we have, in the sense that conceit isn't entirely evaporated, really, until we reach enlightenment, or at least so it's said. Now, in English, the word conceit has a particular meaning, a particular connotation, meaning something like vanity or excessive self-love or pride. We talk about somebody being conceited. But in Buddhism, the term has a broader meaning than that. In Buddhism, this conceit is actually a conceiving, a conception of a particular kind. And the word in English actually comes from that root. The word conceit has to do with the idea of a conception, a particular concept that we have, in particular of ourselves. And indeed, the word in the Buddhist context has the same connotation. That is to say, conceit has to do with a particular idea, a particular conception we have of the self, of ourselves. And there are many different places in the texts that discuss what's called the view and conceit I am. This view I am, this conceit I am, is a particular concept, a conception, a mental way that we approach the self. In particular, we approach the self as something permanent, something grounded, something that's always going to be the same in some respect. And so we grasp at it. We think of ourselves as sort of fixed and immutable, with a certain kind of unchanging essence. And indeed, we think of others the same way too, other people the same way, as having their own sort of fixed essence. And this kind of concept, conceiving, leads to, in particular, comparisons. It leads to us comparing ourselves with others in 3 particular ways. That is, that lead to 3 different kinds of conceit. As the Buddha says when he has a discussion with a man named Sona, he says, Sona, there are ascetics and Brahmins who, based upon the aggregates, which are impermanent, suffering, and perishable, regard themselves thus: I'm better, or I'm equal, or I'm worse. What is that but a failure to see truly? What is that but a failure to see truly? Now, the aggregates, I did a recent video on the aggregates. If you want to know more about them, I'll put a link to that video down below in case you want to see it. But basically, in a very small nutshell, the aggregates are the way that we divide up the self into parts. In fact, they are the parts, the only thing that we can look at when we look at the self. This sort of continually changing group of mental and physical events that come and go. And so we look at this group, this bunch of mental and physical events that are coming and going, and we think of it as permanent somehow. And so we come to these kinds of thoughts about ourselves as being a certain way, we think of others as being a certain way, and we make, therefore, these kinds of comparisons. Now, ordinarily, we tend to think of ourselves as better in some regard. We may think of ourselves as smarter or as kinder, as more able in some respect. And that's where we get the sort of ordinary term conceit in English, or being conceited, having excessive pride or vanity. We chalk up our best parts as who we really are. We grasp onto those parts that we think of as best in us, and we think of the rest of them, the rest of our properties, the rest of our abilities where we're not so good, we think of those as sort of passing problems. Here we can perhaps call to mind some recent politicians who thought that all the things that they did that were good were due to their own innate essences as good people, and all of the things that they did that didn't work, well, those they chalked up to the machinations of other people who were trying to defeat them in some way. And this is how we tend to think of the world much of the time, as thinking of ourselves as better, as what is good in us as really essential, and therefore think of ourselves as somehow better than other people. Now, this way of thinking of the world and of thinking of ourselves is, of course, a problem. But it's also really critical to understand that there are two other ways of seeing ourselves that the Buddha discusses, which are equally problematic. Now, the second one is that we can think of ourselves as worse than others. That is, we may underrate our own abilities when compared to those of people around us. This may lead us towards self-deprecation, even self-hatred. And that can be equally a problem, putting ourselves down into a well and thinking of ourselves as so low that we aren't willing or able to put the effort into getting better because we think of ourselves as essentially broken somehow. And again, that's really a problem. The third way is to think of ourselves as equal to others in some essential respect. And that also, for the Buddha, is a problem. And now why? Well, it's a problem because it can lead us to a sense of complacency. That is, we think of ourselves that we're all the same. We're all in the same boat. What's the point of making any special effort? Because we can never really improve ourselves to any respect because we're all essentially the same. And that attitude equally can be a problem. In an early poem attributed to him, the Buddhist monastic Mahakassapa, who eventually, after the Buddha's death, sort of became the leader of the Sangha in certain respects, he wrote a poem talking about how the wise praise people who are not beholden to these three conceits, thinking of themselves as better, of themselves as worse, or of themselves as equal to others. That if they've given up these three conceits, they are really praiseworthy by the wise. And indeed, it's said that the person who has become enlightened is somebody who has given up attachment to these kinds of conceits. Indeed, one of the hallmarks of enlightenment is to cease seeing the world with a certain kind of comparing mind in this respect, comparing ourselves to others in this way. There's one sutta which exists in the Pali tradition, although it appears not to exist in other recensions, so it may not be in the earliest bunch, but in any event, it mentions a pair of monastics, a Khema and Sumana, who have recently attained enlightenment. And Khema and Sumana want to announce this to the Buddha and discuss with him, describe for him, the awareness that they have attained in this attainment of enlightenment. And so Khema goes up to the Buddha and says that in this attainment he realizes that he no longer has any comparison of himself. There's no longer anybody else that he sees as better than him, or as worse than him, or as the same as him. And Sumana makes much the same claim, that somebody in his position, indeed he himself, doesn't see that there is nobody better than me, or nobody worse than me, or nobody the same as me. Which basically says the same thing with different words, that neither of these two monastics sees the world in terms of these kinds of invidious comparisons. Now, which is basically to say that they no longer see the world in terms of fixed selves, of a self being a certain kind of immutable way, where you can say that I am better than somebody else or I am worse than somebody else. Instead, you see the world in terms of change, that things are always in flux. Now, having said that, there are a couple of important nuances here. The first one is that by saying that an enlightened person has given up these kinds of invidious comparisons, I'm not saying that they are incapable of comparing themselves to others. In fact, if we look at the early texts, the Buddha does make comparisons quite often. He considers himself, or he describes himself as being unsurpassed in certain respects, being a Buddha, being the Buddha, He understands that he has certain abilities that are greater than those of others. Now, how are we supposed to understand this? There are, I would say, many nuances to this understanding, but one nuance is, of course, that the Buddha understands this all in a sort of a conventional sense, in the same way that although the Buddha does not believe in a fixed and permanent, unchanging self, he nevertheless uses descriptions of a self. He talks about himself, he talks about other people all the time. These are words that he uses in a kind of conventional and everyday sense. Now, the other feature here is that the Buddha, when he discusses these kinds of selves or comparisons, he does so without any emotional attachment, or at least that's what we're expected to believe. In many places, the Buddha talks about the fact that he isn't bothered when other people say bad things about him. That is to say, if he had described himself as more accomplished than somebody else, and there were somebody who disagreed with him and said, "Oh no, you're not more accomplished than this other person," what it is to say that the Buddha doesn't make comparisons is to say that he has no emotional investment in such comparisons. Ordinarily, when we compare ourselves to others, we do so with a particular emotional tinge. That is, our comparisons involve a kind of clinging, a kind of self-identification, such that when we say that we're better than others and other people disagree, we take it personally. Or when we say that we're worse than others, we do so with a kind of emotional frame of mind, that we feel unhappy, we feel sad, we perhaps feel depressed. When we say that we're equal to others, if other people disagree with us and say that we're either better or worse than others, that may involve our feeling upset in some respect, or else perhaps pride and vanity in some respect. So these are the problems that I think the enlightened person we can expect gets beyond, so that even though they're capable of making such comparisons, the comparisons that they make are not ones that they have any emotional investment in. They're simply descriptions of the way things are right now. So the point isn't that all comparisons are necessarily wrong. Some of them may be correct in a temporary, particular place and time, but it's rather that comparisons ordinarily to most of us, to those of us who are not enlightened, promote clinging to an unskillful notion of self, to an incorrect, a deluded notion of self. And that's why ordinarily we should avoid comparisons. This kinds of conceit is a problem because it leads to these viewpoints, these views of the self, views that I am. Now the second nuance here is that in one early text, Ananda, who was the Buddha's close companion, is asked about whether there are ever times when conceit can be useful. And actually what Ananda says is, yes, there are particular times at which these kinds of comparisons can be useful to us along the path. In particular, he talks about the fact that if we are practicing, we may see others who are more advanced in certain respects than we are. And seeing them, we may ask ourselves, why is it that they are able to do X, Y, and Z, and I am not able to? How is it they are able to get beyond these problems that are still befalling me? And this does involve a kind of comparing mind. But Ananda says that in this case, it can prove useful to us. It can prove skillful insofar as it actually moves us forward on the path. And in this way, we can use a kind of a conceit as fodder for us to get beyond conceit. In other words, this unskillful strategy that we can, or I should say unskillful mind state, can be used to get us beyond such unskillful mind states. Now, this should be understood to be useful in, a particular limited context. And I actually discussed a couple of similar kinds of contexts like these that we find in the early texts mentioned. And I have a video that I made of that a while back, and I'll put a link to it up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page. We've got lots of interesting things for you to check out over there and maybe help us out. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video.